Mayor and council members, thank you so much for having me. Can you all hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Good.
Okay. If there's ever a problem with that, just wave or I don't know if you have the chat box running or not, but go ahead and just give me the signal if we have a audio or visual problem, and we'll try to get that fixed. Thank you all very, very much for inviting me to visit with you virtually. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm looking forward to some time in the future when I can visit with you all in person. But before we start, I'm just curious, how are virtual meetings going for you all? I'm beginning to think that
Pretty
there's
well.
might outlast the pandemic. Going well?
I think they're going pretty well. Finding out the little like neat features you can do on Zoom makes it a little bit more entertaining, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
We're getting most of the bugs worked out.
yeah. Oh, very good. Very good. I'm going to share my screen in just a minute to start my presentation, which is called Suggestions for Success for Elected Officials. During the presentation, feel free to interrupt and ask questions at any time. I want to make the training as useful to you all as possible. So if there are questions you have as we go through the material, please let me know. And also to those of you that are newly elected, congratulations. And to those of you that are incumbents continuing with a term of office, congratulations as well. And so I'm really looking forward to visiting with you tonight. And we'll get started by my sharing my screen here. Okay, very good. You should all now have my PowerPoint slides on your screen, and I did send these down, so there's an electronic copy of the slides that you can keep as well, together with a PDF document of a CIRSA publication that we're very, very proud of. I'm going to hold it up here, but you've also got an electronic copy, I think, in your packet. We, a number of years ago, wrote the first edition of this book, but we republished it last year. It's called Elected Officials Ethics, Liability, and Best Practices Handbook. And we have shipped down some hard copies for you as well. We're very proud of that book. Our audience for this publication is you as elected officials. And we've tried in that publication to write it in a way that's very user-friendly for you as elected officials and touches on the issues that you as elected officials uniquely deal with in your role. Issues such as what are your liability protections as elected officials, what are your ethical obligations, other issues concerning how the governing body works together on behalf of the community, elected officials' involvement in personnel matters, use of social media if you're using that. So we recommend that to you. So take a look at that when you have a chance. So my suggestions for success, I've laid out here just a little bit more about me. I joined CIRSA about 2 years ago as its in-house general counsel. Before that, I was a municipal attorney for mid-size and small municipalities throughout the state. In fact, got my start on the West Slope. And for a number of years, about 25 years, I was a municipal attorney doing essentially the kinds of things that Mike does on your behalf. And that's a great, great job. I love working with elected and appointed officials to help you get things done on behalf of your community. So enough about me. A little bit about CIRSA. So CIRSA stands for the Colorado Intergovernmental Risk Sharing Agency. We're your insurance provider. We are not a commercial insurance carrier. We are what's called a public entity pool that was organized, created under Colorado state law. The city of Cortez has been a member of our property and liability pool since 1995. We were originally formed in 1982. And our ownership, our members and our ownership consists solely of Colorado cities and towns and affiliated entities. We're very, very proud of that. We think that puts us close to our members because the kinds of risks and needs that you have with regard to insurance and risk management are needs that are shared by your sister cities and towns around the state. So we're very proud of the fact that our sole book of business is insuring and providing loss control and risk services for Colorado cities and towns. To give you a sense of our size, we have 281 members. That's about 80% of the municipalities around the state of Colorado. Of that, 278 municipalities around the state are members of our property and casualty pool, and 141 are members of our workers' compensation pool. At the bottom of the slide, there's a link particularly for you on our website. If you go to CIRSA.org, right at the top of the homepage, about halfway across, there's a ribbon called Training and Prevention. And if you drop down on that tab, about halfway down there, there's a page that says elected officials. And we've put in there for you a number of resource materials that we hope are helpful to you in your role as elected officials on behalf of the city. We've got articles in there, webinars, publications. We've got a couple of videos, I hope even a couple of humorous videos that put a little lighter spin on some of the tough issues that you face as public officials. Things like how to deal with, you never have this, right? How to deal with the cantankerous citizen who stands up during public comment. But that could be a tricky issue, both from a practical standpoint of how do we diffuse this issue, and it's also got some liability dynamics to it as well. So check out those materials. I hope they're helpful to you. Give you a little bit more of a sense about your CIRSA coverages. So again, the city is a member of the CIRSA property and casualty pool. So we provide your liability coverages. Those consist of the general liability coverage. That's your standard bodily injury, property damage type claim that's covered under that line of coverage. We have a line of coverage for law enforcement liability that protects the city and its officers for law enforcement activities. We have public officials' errors and omissions coverage. It's also called wrongful acts coverage. From where you sit, the most practical piece of that coverage is it's the coverage that provides you protection against alleged civil rights claims. If someone believes that the council has violated their civil rights, the wrongful acts coverage is the thread of coverage that responds to that. Under our liability line of coverage, we also provide automobile liability coverage for you. There's also an optional underinsured and uninsured motorist protection, and you have elected that optional coverage as well. Give you a sense of the coverage limits there. On the liability line of coverage, you're covered for $10 million is your liability limit for any one occurrence for a liability claim, except for the auto liability where the limit is $5 million per claim. And then on the property side, you have property and crime coverage with this that insures your buildings and the content of your buildings. Also provides coverage for auto physical damage. If, knock on wood, you get a hailstorm and vehicles get damaged, then your auto physical damage is response to that. We have a crime coverage that extends to matters such as employee dishonesty or theft or something of that nature. And then you also have what we call cyber coverage, which helps provide protection against claims that relate to intrusion into your computer systems or misuse of data or ransomware or computer impersonation, those kinds of things. There's actually two sides to that coverage to help protect you. One is the liability coverage. So if, for example, a party says, hey, your computers were hacked and my personal information was stolen, there's some liability for that. There's a liability arm to that coverage, but there's also an expense arm to that coverage that helps you respond to a data breach. And then at CIRSA, unlike some of the commercial carriers, we have a number of optional coverages that are tailored to the types of risks that you as municipalities face in particular, and you participate in a number of those programs. For example, at the bottom of the list here, there's special events liability. That helps increase the blanket of protection when you have a street fair or a festival where you allow third parties to use your right of way for a special event. That helps make sure there's coverage that extends to both the municipality and the people who are putting on that event. They provide some protection. We also do have some excess coverages. You participate in our excess crime coverage, which just gives you a higher limit of coverage for crime incidents. And we also have a program that helps protect your volunteers. If you use volunteers to help get things done on behalf of the community, a fair question is, do they have some protection if they get injured? They're not employees, so they're not covered by workers' comp, but we have a program that gives them some medical coverage if they do have an accident during their volunteer activities for you. There's a link there at the bottom if you're interested in all the gory details about insurance underwriting, where you can get even more details on the coverages that we provide for you at CIRSA. This next slide, just to close out my comments about CIRSA, I put this up here for two reasons. First, my slides otherwise have just a lot of black and white ink. So I did jazz it up here with a little bit of color. But the more important point of this slide is we at CIRSA are very proud of the mission that we carry out on behalf of our members. And this page here is what we call a storyboard vision statement or a storyboard mission statement. We undertook this exercise 2 years ago. It involved everyone within our organization, our board, which is made up of representatives from cities and towns around the state, and all of our employees. We got together and said, hey, well, let's re-up what our mission is on behalf of the cities and towns that we insure. And you know, one of the words that bubbled up in that exercise was, of course, the word risk. Right, that's our bread and butter. That's what we do for you. You know, we help insure risk. We help you manage risk. But the other word that shows up in this storyboard as often, if not more, is the word community. And we're very proud of the fact that we're there for you as much or as little as you'd like to help you meet the goals that your community is striving towards. Right in the middle of the page there, it says, our mission is to provide Colorado municipalities with the knowledge, guidance, and resources they need to effectively manage risk, take care of the bread and butter stuff, right? But also to effectively create the conditions for your community and citizens to thrive. So to whatever extent we can help, please feel free to reach out to us. Every member of CIRSA has a dedicated loss control representative, dedicated underwriters, dedicated claims folks, and we provide all sorts of trainings and loss control and risk management tools for you. So we're very proud to do that. Okay, turning to the substance of my presentation. So my presentation is suggestions for good governance. And I found over the years in doing these presentations, yes, I am general counsel for CIRSA, and I'm a municipal attorney, and we can talk as much as you like about the legal underpinnings of my suggestions. But we found over the years that if you as elected officials commit to kind of the best practices concepts that we're going to talk about, then, you know, by and large, the liability risks are going to take care of themselves. So that's why we've kind of structured this as suggestions for good governance, which will in turn help reduce your risk of liability. Recognize that my presentation is a training resource only. Please ask me any questions that you have throughout the presentation, but I do have to give you this caveat. I do have a pretty good radar. You know, if you ask me a question and it sounds like, you know, the burning question of the day, like something that's going on in the here and now in the city of Cortez, for which you need legal advice or staff support, I'll still give you a few comments, but I'm going to remind you that if you need legal advice on a pending matter or staff support, then you're going to want to look to Mike and John for that support, because I do have a pretty good radar. You know, once in a while I'll get that question. Someone will say, yeah, Sam, I've got a question. What if another town board member does this? And you go, that sounds like something that happened yesterday or is about to happen tomorrow. And so I want to make sure you understand that you'll need to get your own counsel on those kinds of things. Additionally, I'm pretty sure that the suggestions that I give you from a legal perspective are going to overlap neatly with the suggestions and advice you get from your city attorney. But if not, that's on me. Blame that on me. And Mike will call me up tomorrow and he'll say, well, what are you doing, Sam? So if there's any inconsistency, make sure you follow your city attorney's advice. Okay. My suggestion one, whether you're newly elected this April or whether you've been on the council for a number of terms, is always remember the change in roles that you take on as an elected official, right? You're no longer just a citizen of the city of Cortez. You're now a public official, a government official. You're not required to give up your personal life, but it's important to keep in mind that in the eyes of the community, in the eyes of your constituents, you're a government official 24/7, right, Mayor? That's the 10 p.m. phone call, right? On a Friday night, that's the 7 a.m. bump into you at the grocery store. In the eyes of the community, people will always perceive you to be a city leader and an elected official. And that translates to risk, because the things that you say and do, when people believe that you're wearing that governmental hat, and they always think you are, those words and deeds will stick to you as a government official. So remember that. Remember that you're no longer an outsider to city government. You all are now the ultimate insiders, right? So whatever platform you ran on, or whatever may have caused you to want to come to public service, maybe it was the view of there are some things that I'd like to change, or maybe you were a critic or a proponent of a particular issue, or maybe you said, things aren't working there right in the city. I want to get in there and fix that. Those are all kind of outsider perspectives. And now, as the insiders, we do need to understand and appreciate that the city's ways of doing business, the rules, the policies, the procedures that are all in place, they all stick to you as insiders within the organization, right? Additionally, recognize that whatever brought you to service, maybe you were a critic or a proponent of a handful of issues, or maybe even just one very important issue that brought you to public service. Now, as a city council member, you're a representative on behalf of your community and constituents with regard to all of the issues that come in front of you as a city council. And that's a great, fascinating array of things. That's everything from tax policy, right, to running utilities, to dealing with land use, licensing issues. So make it a hallmark of your tenure to be a great representative on behalf of your community with regard to all of the issues that come before you. Okay. Linda, we took care of the oath in April, right? Or right after the April election, everyone took the oath of office, right? I think it's a helpful suggestion to always check in on what that oath of office means, right? I swear to uphold the Constitution and laws of the state of Colorado and the charter and ordinances of the city. That has meaning for you ethically, legally, and morally. And we're going to talk during my presentation tonight about a couple of key principles there. But I think the oath of office embodies a few things. For example, it embodies a commitment to respect the boundaries and allocations of responsibility within any government organization, no matter how large or small. Everyone within the organization has essentially a job description and has certain limits on their authority and their powers. And it's important from a risk management standpoint to understand and appreciate what those boundaries are. Also, as elected officials, you made a commitment to lawful conduct, including following the constitutional requirements, right? Remember what's that, Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution, right? No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Part of city council's job is to make sure that you deliver due process to people when you're making decisions about their property rights. And we're going to break that down just a little bit. But that commitment includes providing due process and following the rules and the criteria that apply in decision making. You, of course, when you got elected, whether you're elected or appointed or city staff, everyone's subject to the state code of ethics. And so you made a commitment to ethical practices. And then my last bullet here, maybe this doesn't flow as neatly or as apparently from the oath as the other ones, but I always like to remind folks that when you get elected to city council, you're elected to be one member of a 7-member council, but that council, that council is but one voice. There is but one council. Yes, all 7 members have participation and input, but at the end of the day, the council speaks with one voice. Sometimes you're going to get to that voice by a 4-3 vote, and sometimes you're going to get there by a 7-0 vote, or just a head nod, or a thumbs up to John on consensus, whatever it may be, right? But I think what that means in terms of the oath is we make a commitment to, at a minimum, respect each other's divergent styles and approaches to doing the job, at least towards the end of working together to express council's voice. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means as well. Recognize also that whatever your role was to the city previously, you're now the elected leaders, the stewards, the guardians of the city. The city's a corporation, municipal corporation, and at that 40,000 foot level, you're just like the board of directors. And staying at that real high level, from a council's perspective, one of your main jobs is the protection of the city's interest and assets. And at that high level, a fundamental guiding principle for you all should always be, what's the right thing to do for the city as a city? And sometimes, we get it. Sometimes that's not easy, right? And sometimes that's hard to figure out. Sometimes you're going to have a council meeting some nights where there's a very vocal but very small group of citizens or constituents that are at the podium saying, we want you to do this now, and we need to get this done tonight, and you have to do this, council. And if your reaction to that, you're thinking to yourself, I don't think that's ripe for prime time. Or you're thinking to yourself, I bet if we do that now, just because the group of citizens is demanding we do so, that this might end up in our lap again in a month. Recognize as a council that with these principles in mind, one of your greatest powers and prerogatives is to take the time that you need and get the information that you need to make the decisions that you conclude are going to be the right decisions for the town, the ones that'll stand the test of time. So, if something doesn't feel quite ripe, feels like it needs more time for deliberation, for you all to talk with each other, or needs more information from staff, use that power to use your advantage and use it wisely. And sometimes you can use it to help in those kind of difficult or high emotion situations. You can use that to bring the temperature down and find time to help build consensus on an issue. So use that power wisely, and that'll serve you well. Recognize that one of your job duties as elected officials is to deliver good governance. And we found over the years that really probably depends on a couple of core civics concepts. At least these are my top four. And I found over the years that if you commit yourselves to the civics principles that I've listed here on the left-hand side of the screen, then by and large, your corresponding legal issues are going to go away, right? If we commit ourselves to openness and transparency, we're going to have few, if any, challenges to what we do under the Colorado Open Meetings or Open Records laws, right? For example, do we recognize that the emails that we write wearing our hat as a city council member, with few exceptions, but by and large, those emails that you write as a city council member, those are public records available for public inspection. Commit yourselves to fundamental fairness in everything that you do, and you'll have few, if any, challenges under the due process clause to how you do business. Commit yourselves to being predictable. Another prerogative power that you have is, council, you may sometimes get done with the decision, maybe like on a development plan or something, and it made the decision you had to make, and you say, the rules didn't really work out the way we thought they were going to work out. Those design standards didn't do what we wanted, or the subdivision rules aren't where we want to be. You have the power to change those rules, but you have to follow the right process to do that, right? So be predictable and make sure you understand the principle that you can't change rules on the fly, right? And you should be predictable in interpreting and applying the rules that you have on the books. If you don't, you can at worst face a liability situation, and at best, which is still even bad, you can run the risk of getting a reputation among particularly your business community where people think, oh, I went to city council last month with the same request and I got approved, no problem. But now I'm in front of city council with essentially the same request, and it feels like the rules are being interpreted differently, or more things are being expected. So commit yourselves to being predictable. Finally, my last point on this suggestion is commit yourselves to mutual respect with each other as council members, with staff, with any citizens or constituents that come in front of you or that you interact with. I really do think that that's one of the biggest predictors of your potential liability risk, because you're going to have tough nights, right? You're going to have that meeting with the overflow crowd, and people are coming at you from all direction, and they're telling you, 9 different ways you ought to make this decision, and the testimony is very emotional. And that's but if your citizens go home from that type of meeting and their reaction to that is, you know what? I get it now. Council's got a tough job. They had to take all that information, all those differing opinions, and they had to digest that, distill it down into one decision that was in the best interest of the city. If they say to themselves, but you know, I may disagree with their decision, but I feel like I was heard, I feel like I was respected, and I feel like it was a fair process, then imagine the great trust you're building in the community. And of course, your legal issues are falling away. Because the opposite is what happens, and those are the claims we see, because we see a lot of claims that are root. It's someone going home from a bad process, and they feel like, hey, their reaction is, you know what? I don't feel like I was heard. I don't think they listened to the information. I feel like the decision was already made before I even walked in the room. And I think I got the evidence to prove all that. Then they're off the races in attempting to legally challenge your decision. We really think that a lot of that is built just on a foundation of mutual respect for how you approach doing business. All right, my suggestion too for you all. I hope that for the new members, I hope your first question to Mike was not, you know, can I get sued in this job? But of course, the answer is, yeah, sure, right? As government officials, you can get sued. So I want to tell you the good news in Colorado. I mean, here what I'm going to explain is just the liability protection that you have to the question of, can I be sued individually and be held personally liable for doing my job as a city council member? You know, for example, maybe you say something at a public meeting and somebody says, hey, I think that council member, you know, defamed me, so I'm going to sue them for defamation. So that's when I'm explaining your protection for that kind of risk. In Colorado, we have this nifty statute called the Colorado Governmental Immunity Act. And it basically says the city, and by extension, the city's insurer, will defend you and pay judgments that are entered against you for acts or omissions that you take as a city council member, right? Sounds good so far. There's a catch. So long as you're acting within the scope of your employment and not acting in a willful and wanton manner. There's two kind of odd phrases there, because the first one, scope of employment, you know, as elected officials, you may be thinking, well, what do you mean? I'm not an employee. How does that apply to me? That's just the language that's used in the statute. The real takeaway is simply that everyone needs to know and appreciate what their job description is, what the scope of their authority is. And I'll give you a really easy example. Within your municipal organization, like most, who has the power to write a ticket into municipal court, right? That's your police, right? So the flip side of that is, you know, who doesn't have that authority? We don't as council members, right? And that's an easy example, but I will tell you that once in a blue moon, we do get actual liability claims where somebody says, oh, you know, I think I allege that the elected or appointed officials were lurking behind the law enforcement authorities, and they were directing the improper use of law enforcement authority, right? So that's you can see there's a liability risk in that, and that's just an appreciation for understanding the limits of your authority as a council and individually as council members, okay? The other phrase there is willful and wanton conduct, right? You're protected as long as you're not engaging in willful and wanton conduct. That's just a fancy phrase for this type of conduct that is intentionally undertaken to harm another party with reckless disregard for their rights. My even simpler way of explaining it is it's bad stuff. Bad stuff, right? So just stay away from the bad stuff and you'll be just fine. And bad stuff, you know, does mean things like misusing your cloak of governmental authority to engage in malicious conduct, crime. Of course, there's no insurance for committing crime, or engaging in fraud or other sorts of malicious acts. I kind of sound like the Grim Reaper when I do the second part of this, but it's important to understand there's kind of a double whammy to that. If you're engaging in willful and wanton conduct, you can lose your protection under this statute, right? And you can lose your insurance coverage because your public officials liability coverage follows the same concepts. It says we provide insurance for you in your capacity as an elected official when you're acting as such, not when you're doing things that are outside the course and scope of your authority. So, and in a really bad situation, just recognize that if you actually are held liable for willful and wanton conduct, that's the kind of judgment that'll be entered against you individually, and punitive damages cannot be paid by an insurance company. So you could be individually on the hook for punitive damages. So the simple takeaway is stay away from bad stuff and you'll be just fine. Here's a couple of tips on how to avoid risk in this area. As elected council members, recognize first and foremost that you're primarily do your job by meeting as a body, right? And exercise your responsibility as council members by voting in a public meeting on things that are in front of city council. If you look at all your ordinances there in Cortez, you're going to see throughout those hundreds of pages, all sorts of authority for council, but I don't think you're going to find many, if any, right? Ordinances that say that any single council member has the authority to do this or that for council. You know, the mayor has certain prerogatives as the presiding officer and perhaps a few other things, but essentially your power is exercised by meeting and acting as a group, right? So if you misinterpret that or misperceive that, you know, hey, I have this cloak of governmental authority and I'm a council member and I'm going to go out and do something, particularly if it might create some impact on the rights of a third party, you want to make sure you have authority to do what you're doing so that you're protected. And if you don't, then simply, you know, we appreciate that. People are going to reach out to you individually and say, hey, will the city do this? Or can you do this? Just recognize that quite often you're going to have to tell that person, well, you know, I can't help you individually, but, you know, that's either a council matter or talk with our city manager and he'll let you know what the appropriate process is for the city's involvement in that issue. Okay. Just to wrap up this suggestion, I wanted to give you some real life examples of how we see these issues crop up into claims against cities that we've actually had at CIRSA. The first example is sometimes we get employment cases where individual elected or appointed officials get ensnared in those because of the confusion about roles and responsibilities and who's involved, who has authority to get involved in a personnel matter. For example, your org chart, like every municipal org chart, is going to say certain people have hiring and firing authority. And for you, except for a couple of direct reports, everything is downstream of your city manager. But once in a while, we'll get these claims where someone will get fired and we'll look at the org chart and we'll say, oh, okay, the supervisor here is the public works director. So let's go interview the public works director and ask, you know, public works director, we got a liability claim. This person's claiming wrongful discharge. So in order to help defend you in the city, tell us, why'd you fire this person, right? And once in a blue moon, we'll get the response that says, well, I didn't want to fire him. You know, is that a good start? Not a good start to an employment claim, right? Because then after some conversation, you know, once in a while we'll get this, well, I didn't want to fire him, you know, but some folks on the planning commission didn't like that person, so they told me to fire him. That's a bad place for the organization to be and for the individual appointed or elected officials that get ensnared in that, because it shows that people are outside of their authority and get involved in decisions that aren't theirs to make. Same thing with administrative matters. We'll talk a little bit later about recognizing and appreciating the distinction between policy and legislation, but it does have a risk dynamic with regard to permitting. You as a council, particularly like on a development matter, or maybe a marijuana or a liquor licensing matter, you have a role up to a certain point. You'll make a decision on whether to approve the development or whether to approve the license, but a lot of things that happen after that are purely administrative. And we once in a while see claims where, you know, the city council approves the development, but it was a 4-3 vote. And I actually even had this specific claim in a 4-3 vote. One of the elected officials who was on the losing side of the vote went to the building department a couple of days later and said, hey, you know, by the power vested in me, I'm directing you not to issue building permits. Is that a good place to be? No, I'd say I have to appreciate that as well. Less of a, you know, straight up legal risk, but another thing I wanted to suggest to you is, Mayor, do you have during your meetings a time to go around the dais where each member makes a report? Each council?
Yes, yes, we do.
Yeah. if you're doing that and the mayor says, okay, time for council comments, and you tell the rest of the council, well, since your last meeting, I did this. If everyone else's reaction was, you did what? That really doesn't have, necessarily have a risk aspect to it, but it has a council, are we all on the same page dynamic to it, right? And you want to give that the attention it deserves, because after all, if we ask one of our council members to go do something in between meetings on behalf of council, maybe we ask the mayor to go negotiate for us. He wants to know he's got the right direction. And when he comes back and says, I did this, he wants to feel supported in that, right? So that's a little more nuanced part of the job, right? But take the time, to make sure you have it on your radar. Hey, when is this a situation where I need to check in with council and make sure we're all on the same page, so there's not a surprise when I come back to a meeting and say, I did this, right? So that's another part of the things that you all would want to pay attention to. All right, any thoughts, questions on suggestions so far before I move on to transparency stuff? All right, our suggestion 3 is to honor transparency. It says, public entities and local governments, the expectation of your citizens and under the law is that you have to do most of your business in a public setting. And, your citizens may not be at every meeting with a packed house, but they're watching, and they definitely appreciate and applaud the things that you do to be transparent. You've got a great website. I was on there today, and you can access agendas easily. You can find minutes, you can find the code, you can find information about things the council's up to. Commit yourself to that principle of transparency, and your constituents will applaud you and appreciate you for that. Whatever method you decide on, consistent with whatever resources you have, because the citizen who may not be at your meeting, right? If they can find what they're looking for at 11 p.m. when they get home from work, or find it on Saturday and they go, wow, that's great. I got a quick update by visiting the website to understand what council's discussion was last week about that controversial issue. They will applaud you for that, and they will appreciate you for that. On the risk management side, we absolutely see the point that a lot of the risk on transparency start with suggestions or frustrations by a citizen or a citizen activist that the elected or appointed bodies are not being transparent. They may not be right from a legal perspective. You may be doing everything in compliance with the law, but if you do things that leave a perception that you're being fully transparent and even going above and beyond the requirements, then that tends to lessen your risk in these areas. Okay. Given the time we have, I just want to touch briefly on a couple of transparency concepts. The first is, the incumbents certainly know this, but for everybody, a quick refresher on the open meetings law. And I just want to touch on the main rule of the open meetings law, just as a refresher. And you all, I'm sure, got this in your, excuse me, in your orientations. But remember, sorry about that. The main rule of the open meetings law, as applied to council, right? The Colorado Open Meetings Law, the city council is subject to that, the planning commission, all your appointed boards and commissions and committees. But I'll talk here just in terms of the city council. The main rule under the open meetings law is that whenever 3 or more council members meet to discuss public business of the city, that's a meeting that has to be open to the public. And that simply means a citizen has a right to observe the discussion. The second half of the rule is if a 4th member of council will be there, or it's a meeting at which you're going to take some kind of action, then you have to provide notice and an agenda in advance, and staff takes care of that for you, right? So that's simple enough. A meeting of 3 or more council members to discuss public business is a meeting that has to be open to the public. Some of the questions that come up is, well, does that apply to, social gatherings? I don't know if the mayor, I don't know if you host the council barbecue, but if the mayor did, right, if 3 or more of you are at the mayor's barbecue, is that an open public meeting? No. If 3 of you just bump into each other in the coffee shop, is that a public meeting that's open to the public? No, right? The statute recognizes that it doesn't apply to chance social gatherings or to purely social gatherings, so long as, right, those gatherings do not become a platform for a discussion of public business, okay? Recognize also that you are allowed to have executive sessions, but only for a limited number of topics, and you have to follow certain procedures. I suspect if you had some executive sessions since April, you probably have, is that right?
Yes, we have.
So you know from going through the script that there's a long process to get into that executive session. Very important you follow that to a T. Very important that you make an announcement on the record during the public meeting of this is the topic we're going to discuss. This is the statutory citation, and here's further information regarding the subject matter that we're going to discuss. Important that you do all those things to protect yourselves and make sure your systems are set up to protect confidential information. Remember when I said the rule applies to a meeting, right? So what's a meeting, right? We need to recognize that under the state law, a meeting is any kind of gathering in person, you know, like you used to do in council chambers, but it's also any kind of gathering convened by phone or by electronic means. So this Zoom meeting is an open public meeting. A telephone conference is an open public meeting. And if 3 or more council members use email to discuss public business, that can also trigger the openness requirements of the open meetings law. And that's why you probably have procedures and protocols that, you know, if John sends out to all of you something, just as an FYI, maybe it's got that reminder on there, hey, this is FYI only. And to ensure compliance with the open meetings law, do not reply all. And don't begin to use email, right, as a platform for a discussion of public policy. Because then you're triggering the openness requirement that you probably would not be able to meet, right, in that situation. So recognize that using email or text messaging or social media, those can all create transparency issues because any of those forms of electronic communication can trigger the openness requirements of the statute. Okay. For those of you, I think the term is a Luddite, right? We're not Luddites. We are not. We love technology, and technology is a great tool. But recognize as elected officials that both with regard to open meetings and open records laws, certain requirements apply to your use of email. So these are some of my suggested tips for making effective use of email. You can read those at your leisure. Probably the most practical takeaway is in the last one in the bottom right, right? Wearing your hat as a city council member, don't say in an email anything that you wouldn't want to say during the public meeting, right? Or have read back to you in your deposition, right? Or have printed in the newspaper. Because even in situations where emails may be protected by and large, right? Ultimately, if you have some real mess of a situation in litigation, your email may still be something that has to be disclosed. Okay. I'll just leave those there for you unless there are any questions about those. All right. Who's on social media? Everyone? Anyone? All of us? Facebook accounts? Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok? Yeah. So recognize that on those platforms, we don't see too much of this. There's a chapter in the handbook here that's new this year in the new edition about social media. But do recognize there is a dynamic to this, that if you are using social media, to do your job as an elected official, then there are certain legal principles that can come into play. These are just some headlines that we clipped real quickly about some issues that we've had and that we've seen elsewhere about elected officials' use of social media. The one about at the top there about the Lafayette mayor, we had another one involving another elected official here on the Front Range. And the background on those cases are they each had Facebook pages that they used to kind of help them do their job as elected official. Maybe the Facebook page actually identified them as a public official and said, here's where you can contact me as a member of city council. And they use the Facebook page to always post, repost city press releases or information about city events, right? Or, hey, citizen, feel free to contact me here by message if you ever want to talk about any city business. Does that start to sound like it's a government tool for communicating, right? If it does, then you can run into an issue where your social media page can become subject to First Amendment principles, right? The takeaway being that if you have a social media site that walks and talks like a social media site that you're using for your government official role, then you don't want to be censoring the content. Because what you're then doing, right, in the challenges that we had out of a couple of municipalities in the Front Range, we had citizens who had posted some comments to the mayor's Facebook page. And then the mayor took the comments down, and these citizens said, hey, you can't do that. You opened up your Facebook page basically as a public forum for public discussion of ideas. So if you start taking down my comments, you're really violating my First Amendment rights. So that may or may not be true, but it's an issue to pay attention to if you do have a social media site. Take a look at the chapter in the handbook. That'll give you some tips on avoiding those potential risks. Okay. Any questions about that? While most of what I talked about here was transparency, I do want to point out that there's a flip side to that. And there are situations where not only does the law allow it, and it's completely defensible to do so, but it also may be in your best interest as elected leaders on behalf of the city to have an executive session to discuss private confidential information. And I just put this scenario up here to kind of work through a couple of thoughts on this issue. So let's all just read this quickly together. So let's, in this scenario, let's assume we're all in executive session. It was duly called, properly called. And now we're in council executive session, and we want to develop a strategy for negotiating the purchase of a piece of parkland. We have in the executive session a confidential appraisal that states a value, and council, after some discussion, gives instruction that the city manager and the parks director should go meet with the landowner, negotiate for up to $400,000. Councilmember Jones, sees the landowner at the coffee shop the next day, kind of eager to get the deal moving, and human nature being what it is, tells the landowner, hey, we talked about your property last night, and the city's willing to pay $400,000, and I think council might even go higher because the appraiser thinks the property is worth $425,000. What do you think of that scenario? Anyone have concerns?
Concerns.
Councilmember Rainey, I saw a chuckle there. What do you think?
Let me get on stage here. I think it could be worth more than that. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple ways to look at it.
I would be in big trouble.
Yeah. Who's the injured party here? Who's the injured party?
Well, the one that stands to profit the most. Yeah.
Yeah. Once in a while, we'll get the question from the other council members, not the one who kind of stepped outside their role here, but some other council members will call us and say, well, what can we do about this? What's the legal fix? But quite often we say, maybe you do, or maybe you don't have a rule about breaching confidential information, and maybe you do, or maybe you don't want to go down the process of censoring or bringing legal action or something like that, right? So I think really the more practical way to look at who's the injured party is, I think council's the injured party, right?
Definitely.
Maybe the vote to go into that executive session was 7-0, or maybe it was 4-3, but you owe it to each other as council to be on the same page on that issue, right? Even if it was a 4-3 vote to go into that executive session, if we as council, speaking with our one council voice, believed it was important enough to go into executive session to handle certain information confidentially, then we all have to be on the same page about how we handle that information going out of executive session, right? I know your executive sessions are often late in the meeting, right? You're probably like most, you do it at the end of the meeting, right? But I always suggest this, before you leave that executive session, particularly on matters subject to negotiation, maybe go around one more time, the mayor probably leading this part. They look, of all the confidential information we've discussed here in arriving at this strategy, what confidential information, if any, leaves this room and who are our spokespersons? And then you owe it to each other as council members, as a fiduciary matter and as a matter of trust with each other to honor that commitment, right? Because I think the other injured party here is Council Member Jones, right? Who's got to come back to the council next time around and say, whoops, I let the cat out of the bag. Do you still trust me, right? So that's a trust commitment you owe each other. A couple of issues also, the reason I put this scenario up here is I mentioned the appraisal. So you're going to get documents every now and then that are stamped confidential. If you're unclear as to how to handle those documents or whether they're confidential, just check with your city manager or your city attorney, right? Start with just that basic question. Is this document confidential? Sometimes confidential documents no longer are confidential. Might come a point in time, like in this scenario, there'll become a point in time later on, either when you put this on the agenda for action or after you close on the property where that appraisal does become a public record. But until that time, commit to each other and to the organization that you have agreed upon ways of handling confidential information and systems that are in place to make sure that you protect it, okay? And the other reason I mentioned the appraisal, I recommend to elected bodies in particular that I know they're expensive, but if you're buying or selling property, get yourself that appraisal or get a broker's estimate of value or ask and receive whatever information staff can bring you about the objective value of the property to protect yourselves, right, against accusations that you're paying too much, right, or that you're selling the city property for too little. The last dynamic that we've seen that translates to risk is, particularly on these executive session scenarios, you may have a real tough negotiation and John or staff may need you to have 3 or 4 or 5 executive sessions to get strategy for a real difficult negotiation. But remember that if that eventually gets traction and you're ready to take some action and deliberate in open session on a proposal, that might be the first time your citizens are seeing you talk about this high profile matter, right? So when you put that on the agenda for the first time, try to avoid that dynamic that says, okay, we have an ordinance to approve the purchase of this property. And someone says, well, we've kind of talked this to death. I moved to approve the ordinance. From your citizens' viewpoint, they're going to appreciate and applaud you for giving the background, describe how we got here, why we're undertaking this transaction. You're still going to want to protect the information that's still confidential, but they'll appreciate hearing the background of how you got to where you are on matters that may have been previously the subject of an executive session. Okay. Yeah. Let's move on to ethics. Ethics scandals, in Colorado are rare. I think we're kind of pretty proud of that, right? And they're kind of interesting to read about. Sometimes they're even fun to read about in the paper when they're in another jurisdiction, right? Preferably like the county or the state, not at the municipal level, right? But just recognize that part of the commitment of your oath, of course, is you're subject to the code of ethics. An important piece, I apologize, I should have confirmed with Mike to be certain, but I believe my understanding is that you all are subject to the state code of ethics. You don't have your own local code of ethics. Does that sound right, Mike? Sorry about that. But
yes, we're using this. We use the state code of ethics.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. As a home rule, if you wanted to, you have authority to adopt your own local code. If you don't, then you default and are required to comply with the state of Colorado code of ethics for local officials. One of the practical points there is to recognize that enforcement of the code, the state code, and interpretation of the state code then is vested in organizations, that aren't within the municipality. The DA is responsible for criminal enforcement of the state code of ethics, right? And then recognize also from a risk management standpoint that if you do cross that line and get into a bad ethical situation where you've done something improper, if there's some liability that flows to a third party because of not following the ethical requirements, then there's a potential exclusion to your insurance coverage for that as well. Given the time we have, I just want to touch on 3 issues under ethics, which are kind of the primary things that you might see as elected officials. I want to talk quickly about conflicts of interest, confidential information, and gifts. So for conflicts of interest, there's in the middle of this slide a link to a website where you can go and hear my 2.5-minute spiel on what to do if you have a conflict of interest. But let's just revisit it quickly here. First, by remembering when are we in a conflict of interest situation as a city council member, right? So it's essentially this: whenever the council, or whenever you as a council member are going to take some type of official action that affects your own financial interest, you're now in a conflict of interest situation. As an example, let's say City Council, and I know you just had one a couple of weeks ago, City Council has on its agenda a request for a new liquor license. If you as a council member are a 50% owner of that corporation that's requesting that liquor license, you're now in a conflict of interest situation, right? So what are the things that we have to do? You have to disclose your conflict of interest. You have to recuse yourself from the vote and the discussion of the matter. And you have to refrain from attempting to influence the other council members on how they might decide the matter. So on the recusal piece, you want to do that right up front before the discussion starts. So the mayor says, in my example, mayor says, next item, this is next agenda item is the public hearing for a liquor license for Sam's Liquor. And I need to say then to the mayor, I need to make a comment. I need to make a disclosure. I have a conflict of interest. I'm going to recuse myself. Do you all leave the room then when you have a conflict? Yeah. So what do you think about that disclosure? That sound pretty good? Yeah. I would suggest more, even though the state law doesn't require it. If you say, Mayor, I'm going to leave the room, I got a conflict of interest, to get up and leave, you got a packed house. I assure you that once in a while, the people left behind in the chambers are going, their hair's on fire. They're going, what's the conflict? Oh my gosh, must be so corrupt. What's the conflict? So when you do your disclosure, right, tell everyone what your actual conflict of interest is. That'll build great trust with the community. It'll show everyone that you understand and appreciate your ethical obligations. So you're going to say, Mayor, I need to make a disclosure. I have a conflict of interest because I'm a part owner of the establishment that's requesting this license. Therefore, I'm going to recuse myself and leave the room. That tamps down all the speculation, or worse yet, the wild accusations of what your conflict of interest is, because you will have an opportunity on the record to say in your own words what your conflict was. So don't vote. Don't attempt to influence other members of council. That, of course, means at the meeting and outside the meeting. So you obviously can't call your fellow council members the night before and say, hey, tomorrow we got that liquor license on the agenda. I know I can't vote, but I got your vote, right? That would be improper under state law as well, okay? So check out that link. Recognize that conflict of interest includes, the interest of your spouse, the interest that you hold in a corporation. It also, if you're an officer or a director of a corporation, that's also can trigger the conflict of interest rules. So check those things out. All right, let's move on to confidential information. Just recognize that there's a state law that says you cannot use, right, for your own personal benefit, any information, confidential information that you gain by virtue of being a public official. And that's why it's particularly important, reaching back to my earlier comment, if you're uncertain of whether something's confidential or not, make sure that you ask and get a clear understanding of whether it is or isn't, because in a real bad situation, it gets you crosswise under the state code of ethics, okay? Gifts, gifts. I know you get a small stipend for being on council, but it's not the salary and it's not the big gifts that bring us to public service. It's the love of our communities. Recognize that under the state code of ethics and actually under the Colorado Constitution, you're subject to what we call the Colorado gift ban rule, which is Article 41 of the Colorado Constitution. Okay. There's a lot going on in that gift ban rule, but I can boil it down to 2 sentences for you, just as a quick takeaway. I'm not all that proud of the 2 sentences that I came up with, but I think it's a good practical way to look at it. The Colorado gift ban basically says this: don't accept any gift of more than $65 from any one person in any one year if it's in any way related to your public service. With one huge caveat: don't accept the gift no matter what it's worth if it's clear, right, to a reasonable person that that gift is being given to you to curry your favor on some kind of official action, right, to influence your vote or to reward you for some action that you took as a public official, right? There are certain types of exceptions of what is not a gift for purposes of the rule, things like a campaign contribution, or actually being reimbursed to be a speaker on a panel where you are, in fact, are the invited speaker on the panel, those kinds of things. But pay close attention to those, recognize that, staff's available, they can help you work through those rules. But at the end of the day, it's your individual responsibility to make sure you're in compliance with the state gift rules, which, as a matter of appearance, recognize also that on all matters of ethics, right, it may be that you're absolutely right from a technical standpoint, that you fully comply with the state code of ethics, but appearances matter as well, right? And so if something in your judgment might create an appearance of impropriety or an appearance of conflict of interest that you think is best to avoid, then sounds to me like you're making the right decision then in being conservative and avoiding even an appearance, even if it may not technically be contrary to the code of ethics. Okay. Any questions on that stuff? These are a couple of scenarios here on ethics issues. I'm going to leave them there for you, with one exception. I just want to talk about the one right in the middle. And this is what to do, sometimes let's use my liquor application, my liquor license scenario. What if, as the council member, I hold the conflict of interest and I know that the license request is coming up, I'm going to have to recuse myself, but I get to the meeting and there's only 3 other council members there. So we only got 4 members. What are we going to do in that situation? Yes, David.
I think we'd probably want to table it until the next meeting.
Yeah, but I've got, my contractors are going to be there tomorrow and I need to get this going and we don't meet for another 3 weeks. And my gosh, that's just more delay. That's why government gets a bad name. What are we still going to do? Probably table it, right? Probably table.
Oh, yes, that would be
Yeah.
my,
Yeah, there is a provision of state law that does allow a member holding a conflict of interest to go ahead and participate, notwithstanding the conflict of interest. But I recommend avoiding that if you can. So if it can be tabled and you wait till the next meeting when a couple other council members show up, then you're removing yourself from that risk. The other thing about that state law that I mentioned is that even though it lets you participate, right, notwithstanding the conflict of interest, it says if you want to take advantage of the safe harbor under state law, then you have to make a disclosure that you're going to participate in the meeting and vote, notwithstanding your conflict of interest. You have to make that disclosure 72 hours in advance to the Secretary of State. So you can see in my scenario, if you show up at a meeting, right, and there's only 3 other council members there, there's no way you're going to be able to make that disclosure. So I want you to be protected from the individual accusation. So I would suggest you in that situation, table it. Might be frustrating, but lay it over to the next meeting where there's a sufficient number of members there to avoid any risk to yourself under the code of ethics. Okay.
thank you.
All right. Let's pivot a little bit here. I want to reach back to that commitment in the oath about due process, right? You got a great and very interesting job because it's got a bunch of different parts, right? Sometimes as city council members, you're just legislating, just like a state legislature. You're making policy decisions, adopting new policies and rules that just apply to everybody generally. Don't apply to anybody in particular. Maybe you're making amendments to your animal control ordinances, right? In that situation, you're just adopting forward-looking policy. You don't have an applicant in front of you, right? Nobody's rights are squared right in front of you on that agenda. And that's when the legislative type of rules of engagement apply, right? But there is a whole nother set of decisions called quasi-judicial matters, right? Where different rules apply. And those are the quasi-judicial matters. You're going to know them when you see them and when they're coming, because on your agenda, it says right on the agenda, this is a quasi-judicial matter. We're having a public hearing. That's the situation where you're taking those general rules and you're applying them to the specific applicant, right? Who's in front of you for a specific case. So when you're making those decisions where you apply the general rules to a particular person or a particular piece of property, right? Now we're getting back to that Fifth Amendment principle that I talked about. We're now making a decision that affects someone's property rights, right? And remember, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is where you now have to follow these special quasi-judicial rules of engagement. And quasi-judicial really conveys the concept that you have to treat this like a judge. You have to act like judges and behave like judges because these are essentially judicial matters, right? The key parts of a quasi-judicial matter is we know we're going to have a public hearing. We're going to give notice to the applicant, or the neighbors, or any interested parties. And you as a council, as the decision makers, you have to make a decision that's based only on the evidence that you receive at the hearing. So we have to make a record-based decision. And that decision has to be made by a fair and impartial decision maker. That's you. So you got to do the things that judges would do and don't do the things that judges wouldn't do with respect to quasi-judicial matters. Okay. Given the time we have, I'm just going to run through a couple of suggestions on quasi-judicial matters. Please feel free to interrupt me if you want to break that down more, if you have questions. But on the bottom of this slide here, that's a link to an additional basic training that we've done on quasi-judicial matters. It's a webinar that I recorded that's about 25 minutes long that breaks down tips for you all as quasi-judges on how to approach. For you all at the local government level, the quasi-judicial matters are almost always exclusively land use decisions, like development plan approvals. I think you had one a couple of weeks ago, and licenses. Request for a new license, whether it's a marijuana license or a liquor license, or revocation of a license. Those are quasi-judicial matters. So here are some tips on that. Make sure that you only consider your quasi-judicial matters at the duly noticed public hearing, right? You don't want to discuss them at the work session the week before. You don't want to discuss them one-on-one as council members, right? Because you're judges. Judges don't discuss the case and the evidence outside of the trial. That's a basic expectation of the due process clause, right? Make sure that you remain fair and unbiased. You can take yourself out of the game and deprive yourself of the ability to participate in the discussion and the decision-making if you make prejudicial pre-hearing comments, okay? And I've got a scenario on the next slide where we'll talk about that. Obviously, don't participate in the quasi-judicial matter if you have a prohibited conflict of interest. That can get you in trouble, but it can also put a taint over the council's decision, right? For quasi-judicial matters, this is where we're taking the criteria that are already in our code book and we're applying them to the decision that we have to make. So that's where you want to make sure you make your decision based solely on the relevant criteria that are already on the books, right? Like on the liquor scenario, let's say we have a great hearing, the mayor brings it back and we say, good hearing, thank you applicant, thank you staff for the presentation, thank you citizens for your comments. Let's go ahead and talk about this application. And I say, Mayor, I'll start the council discussion. I'm going to vote no because I don't drink. not, this is part of the job where you have to set your personal preferences and your personal policy perspectives aside. And in fact, on that example in liquor licensing, it's not a relevant criteria, right, to the decision that you don't drink. There are all sorts of criteria. The liquor license has to be at least 500 feet from a school. The operator and the manager have to be of good moral character. They can't hold other prohibited licenses, all sorts of criteria, but you can only apply the criteria that are relevant to the application. And those will be in the staff report, right? So use that as your guide. And then finally, make sure as a quasi judge, you do not engage with one side or the other before the hearing. That's called an outside the hearing communication or an ex parte communication. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Let's talk about this scenario about prejudicial statements. I hope you don't have this scenario ever. We get it once in a while because it's in the allegations in the complaint against one of our members, but here's kind of a somewhat recurring situation. So in this scenario, we said, hey, our comprehensive plan didn't call for this, but we got this application for development. It's a very controversial rezoning and development plan. It's high density, it's mixed use, it's adjacent to residential. It's going to take away some of the neighbors' beloved private open space. The proposal is currently pending in front of our planning commission. And the first night of the hearing got a lot of press, a lot of local news stories about this high profile development. One of our council members has been blogging frequently, or maybe posting on social media about the proposal, pointing out all the problems with the application. He also went to an HOA meeting to tell the neighbors why he's opposed and what's wrong with the project. What are the concerns with that fact pattern? Anyone want to take a swing at it? What do you think?
Not speaking with one's council voice, kind of going rogue.
Yeah, and remember this project's in front of the planning commission, right? It hasn't gotten to city council yet, but yet what we have here is one of the judges at the city council level, right? Already professing a position that he's against the application, right? That's prejudicial. The applicant under the due process clause has the right to say, hey, look, council member, you're supposed to not make up your mind, right? And you're supposed to be unbiased and you're supposed to make your decision based upon what you hear at the city council hearing, right? So why are you putting out on your blog or social media, comments that say vote no? That's directly contrary to your obligations as a judge, right? I know that it's kind of feels a little lonely, kind of like a lonely part of the job. But recognize, because you may have a high profile controversial development and people may want to reach out to you and talk to you about it, but this is a situation where you can't get involved and can't discuss the matter until it gets in front of you at the public hearing. But in this scenario, the risk is that the council members basically making statements that say, I'm already biased, I'm already prejudiced, I'm already against this application, even though I haven't heard the evidence, right? That'd be like a judge in a civil trial saying the night before the trial, I'm going to rule against the plaintiff. I don't care what the evidence is. I'm going to vote no. I'm going to rule it. So that's the due process problem which you can get in. And the other problem here is this council member went to the HOA meeting, right, where he's engaging with interested parties. Doesn't matter whether the HOA is for or against the project, but he's reaching out and engaging with people outside of the city council hearing. And that's also inconsistent with the due process clause, okay? All that makes sense? Right, that all touched on, to give a hint at my last part of this suggestion, and that is that a critical part of being a judge on these quasi-judicial matters is you have to avoid ex parte contacts. And that simply means outside of the hearing discussions with interested parties before the city council hearing. Some examples of impermissible ex parte discussions are you cannot and should not meet with the applicant outside of the city council hearing to discuss the pros and cons of their request. They're basically lobbying you outside of the public hearing. It would be the same thing if it's the opponents doing that, right? You also should not be emailing your fellow city council members before the hearing to persuade them to vote yes or no. Why does that sound odd from a due process standpoint? Sounds like the judges are deciding how they're going to vote before they've heard the evidence, right? And then again, attending meetings before the city council meeting is also inappropriate. So make sure you let, I don't know if you've ever had this issue or problem, but let the planning commission do their job. You don't want to go to the planning commission meeting, right? It'll eventually come to you. That's the good news for you. At the end of the day, only 7 members of the city, 7 citizens in the city of Cortez get to make a decision on that development plan, and that's you. So eventually it'll get to you and you hold the power to make the final decision. But with that goes the commitment that you have and the obligation that you have to give people fair and due process, right? So make sure you stay out of conversations with people before it gets to you, right? If it were your application, would that seem fair to you if those kinds of things were going on, right? By giving you this advice to avoid ex parte communications, we're really trying to empower you or enable you to stay in the game. Because I don't want you to ever face that situation where at the beginning of a controversial high profile development, someone stands up and says, well, Mayor, before you start the hearing, I'd like to ask that Council Member Smith disqualify himself because I've got a handful of emails that he was sending to people in the community saying vote no. And we got a real good argument under the due process clause then that Council Member Smith needs to be stepping aside, right? So make sure you avoid those kinds of things. I get it, that sometimes it's inevitable. Like, what if you get the email from the citizen who sends you an email on do you all have city email addresses? Yeah. So, you'll get that email from the citizen and we want that. You want to interact with your constituents, but on quasi judicial matters, these rules of engagement are different. So if you get that email from citizen Sam that says, Mayor, good evening, I'm writing to tell you all the reasons why you ought to vote no, and here's a bunch of information why, what do you want to do with that email? Okay, you want to respond, if at all, you're going to just respond back and say, thank you for your email. Because this is a public hearing matter, I can't discuss it with you. I have forwarded your email to staff to ensure it's part of our public hearing record, but I can't have a conversation with you outside of the public hearing. I'd encourage you to come to the hearing if you can. If you can't, know that your comments have been sent on to staff for the record. Okay. Any thoughts or questions on any of that? All right, let me move on to suggestion 6. That's to be cautious in administrative matters, right? Every organization, every municipality, no matter how large or how small, does recognize and has a distinction, between policy and administration. And it goes back to my earlier suggestion embedded in the oath about kind of roles and allocation of responsibility, right? High functioning organizations, there's a appreciation and understanding throughout the organization of what is my role, what is the limits of my authority. Staff is asking, is this for me or is this for council? Council is asking, is this the manager's job and not the council member's job? Difficulties in those areas, they can end up causing you to waste resources. They can undermine the structure that you've put in place. Because recognize under your charter and ordinances, you've already, as a council and as a community through your charter, set up a system where you've got a distinction between administrative matters and policy matters, right? So I don't harp too much on that policy administrative distinction, but at the very high level, recognize, that at the highest level, the council's primary, who are the owners of our corporation? The citizens, right? And the council's role, you as a council, you're the legislative body, you establish the policy and the vision. You're the ones most uniquely qualified to help determine the citizens' wants and desires, and how do we, as a government, put governmental resources on that at a policy level. Your timeline is, long-term. Council's looking at the yearly budget, the 5-year capital improvement plan, the master plan. Where do we want this community to be in 3, 5, 10, 15 years? And that's where council does its best work, because you've already put in place a system, right, where you have a city manager and staff to deal with the day-to-day operations of the organization. So kind of in that management philosophy way of looking at things, there is a distinction between policy and legislative activity, which is in the council's purview, and determining the ends, and the manager and staff determining the means and dealing with the day-to-day administrative matters. Okay. That distinction is particularly important in personnel matters, right? It's important in all areas of the organization, but recognize, particularly on personnel, because it translates to risk, as I mentioned earlier. Recognize that council does have an appropriate role in personnel matters, but it's a limited role, right? You've already set up a system where the city council has a couple of direct reports, and those are, might need your help here, those are the city manager, city attorney, your municipal judge. Any others?
Those would be it, sir.
That would be it, right?
There's 3 of us.
Yeah, so recognize that from where you sit as council members, then everything else regarding personnel by way of your charter and your ordinances, you've already delegated and assigned to the city manager. And from a risk management standpoint, that's a great place to be as an elected official. Because whenever there's a major personnel issue that's a problem, and someone wants to ensnare you in that, your response is, council doesn't get involved in those matters. Council only supervises the manager, the attorney, and the judge, right? So your role on personnel matter, stay with those big picture items. You might, I don't know if you do or not, but maybe you approve the general overall personnel rules. You obviously deal with the overall personnel budget, the ultimate number of FTEs. You probably set overall goals and priorities for the organization, right? But recognize there's clearly the distinction between saying, to John, as part of next year's budget, I'd like you to build in, we as council would like you to build in, 3 more FTEs for street maintenance because we want to up our game in that area. That's the high level stuff for you. That's far different than saying, oh, HR staff, I see you got a vacancy in the streets department, and I know who I think you should hire. That's an inappropriate involvement, right, that can come back to haunt you. So be careful in that regard. We recognize, so make sure your involvement in the big picture stuff stays at that. With regard to your direct reports, make sure you do set aside the time and have a process, right, to do the things that you need to do, right? You owe it to your direct reports to have the performance evaluations, to agree upon a process, embrace that process. Don't skip evaluations, find the time that you need as council to have those evaluations and have good discussions about workflow, work plans, work priorities with your direct reports. But make sure your involvement in that big picture stuff does not devolve into getting involved in, selection, evaluation, or discipline of someone who's not your direct report, because that can get you ensnared in potentially a problem, right? And I get it, no matter what organization, and I assure you that our members that have populations of over 100,000, sometimes the elected officials are going to see this scenario. Some employee might come up to you and go, as an elected official and go, psst, can I talk to you about my boss? Right? And what's our response going to be if it's not the city manager, the city attorney, or the judge? What do we want to do with that situation? Yeah, we want to tell that person, I as a council member, and we as a council don't get involved in HR matters at that level. We appreciate our employees, but I would recommend that you have you checked with your supervisor, or have you checked with HR or the manager, and they can provide you assistance with that issue. So trust and respect that allocation of responsibility on those matters throughout the organization, and that'll serve you well. We at CIRSA know, because it's what we do. We know in the risk arena there are some real messes, and once in a while you might have a real mess, right? Where someone says, can I talk to you about my boss? And before you can respond, they go, he's racially discriminating against me. We're not going to respond back to that by saying, well, I'd recommend you go back and talk to your boss, right? But recognize that there are systems in place to deal with the real, we call them the ones with a lot of hair and warts on it, the real difficult situations. There are systems in place where the attorney and the manager, and if CIRSA resources are needed, that we will help you manage a very difficult employment situation consistent with accountability and getting the information that you need as elected officials. Because once in a while, John may have to give you an FYI on a personnel matter, but it's not, maybe you got an employee tomorrow, the FBI called you and said, hey, tomorrow, city manager, just want to give you a heads up, tomorrow we're going to have some agents come and arrest one of your staff members there at City Hall. That's probably news, right? But your manager may be giving you just an FYI or a heads up just as an FYI to help coordinate our message. But be cautious and trust the system that even on the very difficult, high profile matters, there are systems in place to handle those, okay? Finally, related to this suggestion is when it comes to speaking to your direct reports, commit yourself to speak with one voice, right? Even though you got 7 council members, it's not a group of 7 bosses, it's one boss. Sometimes you're going to give that direction by a 4-3 vote. Sometimes it's going to be by, thumbs up or a 7-0 vote. But you want to make sure as council that you commit to resolving this dynamic. If you got an item at the meeting and mayor says, let's give the city manager some direction, and you go around the room and each of you has a different idea on what the direction is, we then say to the manager, have you got your direction? Probably not, right? May depend on what the hour it is at that point, but that's the situation where council owes it to itself, and council owns the issue of, hey, we got to work it a little more so that we give clear direction to our staff, right? That's where you as a council are going to have clarity and credibility and get accountability, where you commit to working through your differences on issues and giving clear direction to your staff. Commit to do that. It'll help you, and it'll help you also have accountability on what you expect from staff. Okay. Finally, suggestion 7. I mentioned putting ethics first. Recognize that there's also other issues involving personal conduct that relate to your effectiveness and to your risk. Recognize that the way you conduct yourself in relation to other members of council, to staff, that greatly impacts your effectiveness, right? Recognize that you as the elected leader set the tone for the whole organization in terms of how you treat each other, the employees, the business community, the citizens, and that the organization becomes a reflection of your tone and temperament, right? So use your tone and temperament in how you approach issues effectively and to your advantage. From the liability side of it, absolutely recognize that certain types of liability risks, in particular the civil rights claims, they can be exacerbated by bad facts that suggest that council or individual elected officials were acting in a retaliatory or overreactive way. We know that's not easy. Sometimes it feels like you got a target on you while you're sitting up there, and that public comment period started, and the first 15 seconds into a public comment, it's some just absolutely inflammatory, outrageous comments, right? That's the ones where we're going to be patient. We're just going to tell them after their, 90 seconds, Mayor, or 3 minutes? You get 3 minutes to speak during public comment? 4. When their 4 minutes are up, in that sort of inflammatory situation, there's probably nothing you can say that's going to make it any better, right? And so you may just want to approach that by saying, thank you for your comments, next speaker, right? But as a council, find time to talk about how you're going to approach those situations so that they don't bubble up into a situation where someone accuses you of overreacting or reacting in a retaliatory fashion, okay? Commit yourself to a no surprises approach, right? Your council meetings ought not to have kind of a surprise or gotcha moment. From where you sit as a council member, it's always appropriate to call your city manager and getting ready for the meeting with a heads up. If you see something that's lacking, or you've heard something that might bubble up during the meeting, just to give a heads up so that people are prepared at the meeting for something that might come up. Avoid the dynamic of criticizing staff in the public meeting in a way that reflects poorly on yourselves or the organization. If you have concerns about a staff issue, who's your point of contact and accountability for that? Your manager, right? So find the right time in the private setting if you have a concern to raise that concern. always commit to act as we as a council. That's how you're going to build strong relationships, when you're saying, we as council, let's do this. We as council have this as our priorities. Part of the job also requires, from where you sit as an individual council member, to recognize that sometimes you may not get sufficient support. And so sometimes you have to recognize that the we can't become an I for the health of the organization. Like, you might have a policy priority that's very important to you individually. Hey, I'd like council to rewrite our short-term rental ordinance. I want to do this. I want to do this. But if it's not on council's work plan and 3 council members don't support you in that, that's where you have to say, I better let the I go for the we, and those dynamics are important. Finally, my last point in this area is to deal effectively with discord as a council. Every public body has disagreements at some time, right? You got 7 members of council who were elected by the citizens. You didn't know it would be the 7 of you, but it is, right? And we've got great and diverse perspectives and personalities and ways of doing things. And of course, we're going to have disagreements. The disagreements are healthy. But if our disagreements are driving our agenda, or driving how our meetings are run, or driving how we interact with the community, find ways to effectively deal with that discord, because it's a wise council that spots those issues early and finds ways to nip it in the bud. Could come from any source. You know, it's the dynamics that we've seen, or that I've gotten calls about from elected officials at CIRSA. Well, before I go there, you say, well, why are they calling the CIRSA attorney about this? Because sometimes, or they'll call our executive director and say, no, I have concerns with a fellow elected official. How do we get at that issue? And the discord could be from any number of sources. Maybe there's this bubbling up a feeling that there's unequal access to information, that some of us are more in the know than others. Or maybe it's a bubbling up sentiment that the discussions are unbalanced, that certain members of the body are driving the discussions to the point where others feel that they're not being heard. Or that there's a sense that, hey, why are we always lining up on the same voting blocks, right? Whatever that kind of discord is, find the time in the appropriate forum to discuss and attempt to resolve those issues before they become major issues for you, and that'll serve you very, very well as a council. My final suggestion, just a couple of bullets, is to use your power wisely and humanely. And always remember that the municipal organization, the city, is a reflection of its leadership, particularly its elected leadership. Going back to my 40,000 foot level, always commit yourself to best practices. And if you do that, your liability risks will always take care of themselves. If you commit yourselves to best practices, your citizens will appreciate and applaud you for that. And no matter how difficult the situation, always commit yourselves to acting with mutuality, with respect. So with that, I'm done. I've set aside some time to take questions. If there's anything that you'd like to talk about or have questions about, on the last page there, I just recap some of the resources that are available for you all as elected officials, where you can find an electronic copy of our handbook. Right in the middle there, our executive director, Tammy Tenoy, has also recorded and put up on our website kind of an orientation seminar for newly elected officials. Comes at it from a slightly different angle than my suggestions. And if you have time, I would certainly recommend that to you. Tammy's a great speaker and has a very interesting perspective on how to approach the job if you're newly elected. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, and then I'm available to take any questions that you have. So Mayor and Council, thank you very, very much for having me.
Sam, just want to say thanks for sharing with us. You've answered several questions that I had been unclear about, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Yeah, Sam, I'd like to say how much we appreciate your appearing before us and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And We greatly appreciate it and look forward to meeting you in person soon.
I look forward to visiting.
I have a question that may be on a lot of cities' minds. With everything that's going on, having a Zoom meeting versus an in-person versus a hybrid meeting, what is the liability of having a hybrid meeting? Does that create risk of the decisions we make and that they can be overturned, or I mean, what is everybody going through right now?
Well, you're not alone, right? We've got among our membership, we have governing bodies and appointed bodies that are doing all three of those things. Some are starting to meet again, socially distanced. Some are staying all virtual like we're doing now. And then as an example, I went to a meeting with one of our members up north recently where I was there in person. Three of the council members were in the chambers. The meeting was still being broadcast by Zoom, and there was a feed for the public to participate by Zoom. In late March and early April, there was a lot of concern about how the risks of conducting quasi-judicial meeting hearings, in particular by electronic means. But I have to admit, I was very concerned at that point, thinking, how consistent with the due process clause can we have an electronic public hearing at all? It's just going to be a field of landmines where some type of misstep where a person can't enter an exhibit or the technology fails, they're just going to bring a claim challenging your decision on due process grounds. But we haven't seen, they at least haven't bubbled up in the claims, and our members are reporting back that their meetings seem to be running well, that people appreciate the platform. If we're doing things in a hybrid manner, we just need to make sure we proceed methodically and cautiously, and particularly in the public hearing setting, make sure that if someone says, well, I have a document that I'd like to share, that there's a way to get that done, or at least to get that information shared with everyone, and that everyone has a chance to speak. There is a good article that we wrote in late March, early April about just this issue, conducting meetings by virtual means, and it points out some of the potential pitfalls. But if you take a look at that and then just reflect on what you're doing, then you'll probably find that if you're following those pointers, make sure people have access, opportunity to speak, the documents are handled appropriately, that you'll be just fine. Yeah. I'm curious if whether you think that this kind of meeting platform will outlast the pandemic, whether you think down the road you'll be doing things virtually, or you'll be going back to meeting in the room as soon as things settle out.
I think there's interest in meeting personally, but I think there may be applications where the virtual meetings have merit as well.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to agree with that.
We tell our members that if you're going to have participation electronically by the members, that you make sure you have a written policy, right? That protects you all as an organization from the suggestion. So, well, wait a second. How is it that that member can phone in or participate by Zoom? Where's the policy, right? Oh, well, here's our policy, and this is how it works. And it, that can come from outside or inside. Members who've adopted electronic participation policies, and they say that you can participate electronically if you're an elected official and you happen to be ill that evening. Well, best of intentions, what's the second question that comes up? Well, I'm not ill, but can I still participate by phone? So, those kinds of things are important to be on the same page with each other about what those expectations are. But we found, our members reporting that once they got the glitches worked out and figured out a way to do the flow of public hearings, that it's worked well. Last point on that is some members, I don't know if you're doing that locally, but some members are asking applicants for public hearings to agree to essentially protect the municipality against any claim that may arise solely from using the electronic platform for the public hearing. We're kind of agnostic on that, you know. We haven't seen those actual cases bubble up, but some members are using that tool to tell the applicant, okay, yeah, we'll go ahead and have the public hearing, but one of the things you have to do is agree to protect us, that if someone challenges the decision we make based solely on the fact that we had the public hearing via Zoom, then you're going to handle that litigation.
On the other hand, if you do these meetings all with all of us in there, and some of us do have handicaps or disabilities,
Mhm.
you know, we can't wear masks. And so to keep the public happy, that's why we're talking doing a hybrid type
Right.
meeting. So I
Yeah.
mean, we have some diversity in our council.
Right. Right. Yeah, so that's championing, making sure everyone has access and can be inclusive. And, you know, if you end up at a point where your resources allow it, and that's where you want to be as a council, that additional means of access, I think by and large, people are gonna applaud those. There'll still be issues that come up, but I do foresee a number of our members will be wondering post-pandemic whether they want to continue to have platforms for public participation via Zoom or even member participation. I keep saying Zoom, but just in the interest of full disclosure, in doing my trainings, Zoom, GoToMeeting, Google Hangout, WebEx, Skype, whatever the platform may be.
We're gonna have some people unhappy one way or the other, you know that.
Right. Yeah. Embedded in I think my earlier suggestion about those tough nights where people coming at you from every different angle, you're going to have those occasions where you get the reminder that this is not, the elected official job is not the one where you're going to make 100% of the people happy 100% of the time. Right.
No.
Any other questions or thoughts for me?
I just want to say thanks, Sam. Those refresher courses sure helps about when everything's going on. And I just want to say thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. I don't think I heard that you still have an agenda yet this evening, right? So hopefully you got a little time to grab a snack or whatever it may be. And I hope to see you all in beautiful Cortez soon.
Bye,
Thanks.
Sam.
Be
Bye.
safe.
Thank you. You too. Now get you some masks shipped out.
Thank you. Okay, if there's no more questions, we'll adjourn the workshop special meeting, and we'll rejoin the regular council agenda at 7:30. You can, anything else, Michael Green?
Nothing. Sam's given us a lot of food for thought.
Exactly.
Things to talk about and think about.
Okay, then, we'll see you at 7:30, folks.
Mike got his hair cut.